Tim Harte is a Deakin researcher working at the intersection of materials science and disability advocacy. From lab breakthroughs to taking centre stage at the United Nations, Tim shares how his lived experience fuels his drive for impact and change. Oh, and he's also nominated for Young Australian of the Year. From the lands of the Wadawurrung people, this is Stories of Wonder. Tim Harte, welcome to Stories of Wonder.
Thanks. It's great to be on the podcast today.
So you're currently doing a PhD in sustainable energy storage materials. You've recently addressed the UN on disability, but up until 19, you were a professional ballet dancer. Can you tell us a little bit about your journey to now and how you got here today?
Yeah, definitely. I think in summary, my journey to doing a PhD in I guess sort of academia is certainly not a linear one. It has been a little convoluted, you could say. So basically, I started ballet when I was 3 because it was part of school in England, and there was a choice where I could go outside in the cold and play soccer, or I could stay inside in the warmth with nice piano music. And I quite liked the warmth, and I liked piano music. I thought it was a pretty good prospect.
Yeah,
pretty good idea. So that's kind of what got me hooked. Basically, being in the warmth, instead of the cold English winter outdoors.
Where in England are you from?
So I was born in Nottingham, and I kind of mostly grew up in Kent, so sort of in southeast, kind of from London.
Right.
But then. That's kind of, I guess, what got me started was sort of, ballet's offered in school. I did it, and then my family moved out to Australia when I was 5, and I kept going with ballet, initially in Woodend, actually, because we lived in Kyneton at the time, and then moved to the Geelong area in sort of 2003-ish, and started at Geelong Ballet Centre for years. So I was there for many years, and really, the turning point, I think, happened when I was about 11, where I did a summer school at the Australian Ballet School in Melbourne. And it was pretty cool that my sister was 18 months older than me, and we'd always do this together. So basically, every day of the summer school, we would catch the train up by ourselves. We were sort of 11, 12, a bit of an adventure, seeing the big city, and then, do ballet for the whole day and come back at the end of the day. And at the end of that week, I told my mum, I said, you know what, I want to do this every day. And basically my mum was very supportive, and she put in place what I needed to do to get there, basically. So all through my teenage years, I actually did distance education. So I went... I completed my secondary schooling through Distance Education Centre Victoria, which is now called Virtual School Victoria.
Yeah.
I do have reservations about the name, but I won't go into that now.
Yeah, it sort of sounds like a fake school, right?
I prefer Distance Education Centre Victoria, DCV, which...
We'll let them know. You can write in if you...
I can give them some feedback on that, definitely. But basically I did, school by correspondence all through my secondary schooling from grade 6 to year 12. And that was basically because I was doing over 20 hours a week of ballet.
Wow.
And I did that until I was 17. And then when I was 18, I went to the Australian Conservatoire of Ballet. I was accepted there to do an advanced diploma of dance, elite performance. And I did a year and a quarter there. And then I transferred to the National Theatre Ballet School, and I sort of did 2 years of full-time ballet training at a tertiary level. Yeah. And that was before I acquired disabilities, which was sort of at the end of that 2-year period. And I did get a diploma of dance elite performance qualification from that, thanks to our great, higher education system. And I do really enjoy putting that on my email signature and confusing professors when I email them. I emailed one about 4 months ago with a collaboration idea, and sort of, I do hope the collaborator in Michigan sort of read my email signature and went, wow, he's got a Bachelor of Science and diploma of dance elite performance. What? This guy's got skills. Like,
yeah.
Yeah.
Uniquely qualified, I'm sure, for something that requires both.
Yes,
that's what we're on the journey to
well,
find.
and as you might see from some of the Institute of Frontier materials, social media,
Yes.
we do combine some of the Diploma of Dance,
Yeah. You're putting it to good
transferable
use.
skills, I would call them.
Yes, definitely.
To the social media of the Institute.
Yeah.
And so basically, I acquired disabilities at the end of that year. I started passing out. I started having weird neurological symptoms.
Wow.
The joke I always say is, I started dropping girls. I didn't actually drop anyone, luckily. I was just dropping myself. And I sort of presented to the emergency department at the end of that year with weird symptoms, had an MRI. And then I took a gap year where I was supposed to get better. Initially, I planned to do other study, and I think I even planned to do a Pilates course at one point, sort of as an interim before getting back to ballet. And I just kept getting worse symptom-wise that year, and it took about a year and a half before I got any diagnoses. And that was quite a complex journey of, I'll touch on it later, but quite often with these complex medical conditions, you get so focused on, what's wrong with me? What's wrong with me? What's the diagnosis? But just because you get a diagnosis doesn't mean there's a treatment or a cure. So in my case, there's no treatment for the conditions. There's treatments for symptoms, which does help and, does make my life a lot better than it would be. But there's no magic bullet. There's no golden pill that, just fixes everything. So that obviously, took a while, a year and a half to get a diagnosis. And then after that, there was quite a period of about 2 years where, at one point with my light sensitivity, for example, I tried a medication that made me almost blind. So,
goodness.
In many of these things, you can kind of try everything under the sun, which sometimes, like one of the medications I had, this main side effect was vivid dreams. So I had a very interesting, I don't think you quite know what a vivid dream is until you have a vivid dream, but it's very vivid. Which when I had the vivid dream, I was like, oh yeah, that's good warning. It was very vivid. So very weird too.
And so if you're comfortable, share, what was the diagnosis of?
Yeah, so part of the issue for me symptom-wise was that I was having dizziness, but I was having two forms of dizziness.
Okay.
So I was having dizziness from a low blood pressure heart condition called postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, which is quite common in young women presenting in puberty, but less common in men. And then that was combined with a low blood pressure, initial orthostatic hypotension, which is basically where you stand up, your blood pressure drops extremely, and there's not that much regulation of your blood pressure by your body. Right. So there was that kind of, if I stand up, I'm on medication now, so if I stand up, there's going to be less of an effect. But if I stood up suddenly now, if I've been sitting for an hour or so, I would have a blacking of vision sort of top down.
Yeah. Okay.
That was different though to a neurological condition that was also impacting dizziness. So I was having, I have vestibular migraine, which is a neurological condition linked with inner ear and balance. And that is kind of, you feel like you're on a boat. So you're kind of like the world's going round. So there was sort of two different forms of dizziness, and in some ways I was kind of stuck between the cardiologists and neurologists, and it wasn't until they sort of deconvoluted things and sort of said, okay, well, we've done I had to do a tilt table test, which I'm not sure if you're familiar with.
Yeah, what
Basically,
is that?
they stand you up on a table until you pass out. It's kind of a interesting technique.
What a fun test.
I know, not the greatest test. And then of course when you pass out, they pump you full of fluids to sort of bring you back to consciousness. And from experience, the fluids are not warmed; they're quite cold. So it kind of feels like a bit of a shock to the system when you have a bunch of sort of cold fluids going in your veins. But basically there were sort of different tests that they did that finally worked out what was causing my main symptoms. And then there were also other medical conditions that were kind of causing some side what I call sort of secondary impairments and sort of experiences that I was having difficulty with, but weren't really impacting my life. The main two were having a massive impact on my life before stabilization.
Wow.
Yeah.
How long did it take them? Like, how much of a process did you have to go through to get
a
that
very
all
long
figured
process.
out?
So even so to figure out what it was another probably year and a half after I actually got into the right people.
Right.
And then even then there were sort of the best medication for my neurological condition is Botox injections, which I know it sounds, most people associate that with cosmetic procedures, but
You're looking great, by the way.
well, I actually stopped Botox last year and tried a new medication, and I do have a wrinkle here that reappeared. So I had a cosmetic side effect of the Botox, which I did find quite funny because obviously, every time I was getting sort of 40 needles in my face every 3 months or so, and it's not really something that you do by halves for no reason without quite a good reasoning and good motivation for it. So I did laugh about the single wrinkle that would disappear on my head. But to be eligible for the Botox, I had to fail 3 medications. One of them really messed with my sleep. One of them had weird vivid dreams. Another one, the side effect was that you would, so most of these medications are repurposed antipsychotic medications. So they're not really designed for migraine or vestibular migraine, but they can work for some people and variable, some people, swear by them. They didn't really work for me. And one of them, the side effect was that all your hairs would stand on end and you feel like there was a ghost behind you. That feeling. I've forgotten the term, but basically you'd feel like
I think that's what it says on the
You're like,
tin, doesn't
I
it?
feel like
You
there's going to be an
there's a ghost
earthquake
behind
in.
you.
I feel like there's going to be an earthquake in like Samoa or something, or like you'd feel a bit of a anyway. And then even in the last 2 years, I've tried another 3 or so different medications. So I tried 2 different auto injectors, which are designed sort of for antibodies related to the migraine. And even recently with my nerve block injections, I've tried a new mix of nerve block and corticosteroids. So it's an evolving space.
Yeah.
I'm very lucky that my neurologist or neuro-otologist is actually an associate professor at the University of Melbourne. So is world leading in this area. And really knows, you know what? This literature said this. Do you want to try this out? And I'm always very willing to, because I do have significant impacts on my functional capacity from just the amount of pain that I'm in all the time. And, surviving a day is sort of going through 4 or so neurological exacerbations. Yeah. So it is tough, but, without medication, without, the substantial support from my medical team, I really wouldn't be where I am now.
Yeah. Shout out to them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess if I reflect on my journey, adversity has shaped me, but it has not stopped me. No. So that really is I'm sort of trying to work on concise messaging with the nomination that you might be aware of. Mm-hmm. And this is something that I really have reflected in my story. I have encountered many barriers in my life. I survived domestic and family violence as a child. I struggled a lot with my mental health in my late teens, which coincided with a lot of ballet, being very intensely focused on something, which is I think that was probably a good outlet for my mental health in terms of being, really focused on something. But, and then I had obviously the journey of acquiring disability, and I often sort of, I think I mentioned in some of the pre-discussions before this that, at one point I sort of realized, I think I'm disabled now after I kind of, I was on the disability support pension. I was a National Disability Insurance Scheme participant. I had a disabled parking permit, and I sort of thought, I think society's telling me I'm disabled now. And I think, that because for the first 2 years I was sort of, I'm just got chronic illness. And then I kind of came to terms with, okay, so, and understanding sort of the different models of disability a bit more. And initially, the social model of disability, which really frames disability as more a sort of societal construct, that for me, I think it was beneficial, but I did clash with that a little bit at first because I sort of thought, well, that doesn't really take into account my the effects of my impairments on my everyday. That every day I'm pushing through impairments and pain. that has nothing to do with society. That's just a reality of what I go through every day. So I did find another model of disability, the biopsychosocial model, which kind of does, it does sort of still place quite a lot of onus on society and those barriers, and particularly sort of both perception and sort of social barriers of sort of stigma, discrimination and such, as separate to structural barriers. But, for me, for example, at the recent conference that I went to in Fiji, we had a power out twice during the conference, and I turned to the person next to me and I said, "Oh, Helen, I think it's accessible for me now because it's nice and dark. Of course, no one can see anything." And, she laughed about it. And, yes, there are lighting conditions that can work for me with my glasses off, but at the end of the day, you kind of still need to have enough light to sort of see something on paper. So, there is limitations to how much society is a barrier for my impairments personally.
Yeah. We'll touch on that a little bit more later again, and as well as that nomination that you mentioned there. But let's roll it back a little bit. And so you kind of had to stop ballet. Yeah. You had a year off by the sounds of it. How did you end up at Deakin?
Yes, so because through my year 12, I did year 12 over 3 years. So I did 2 subjects early in year 11, which was maths subjects, so maths methods and specialist maths. And then I did, once I started the 2 years of full-time, I did just one subject because obviously I was doing full-time study in the day and I was just kind of had enough time for one subject. Because ballet was my priority at that point, I chose to do non-graded VCE, which at the time it wasn't quite explained to me that I wouldn't get an ATAR from that. So I kind of, I made that choice to sort of do non-graded because it was less pressure and I had other priorities. But then when I went to start a new career, I did encounter some barriers because I didn't have an ATAR.
Right.
So I initially applied for a Deakin Bachelor of Science to, I guess, start a new journey. And then there was much encouragement from my mum. I probably wouldn't have taken that step of that leap of into a new area without my mum's encouragement. But she was very strong and sort of, well, you can't do this you can't take a gap year for the rest of your life. You have to move towards something. You have to build a passion in something.
And did you have an interest in science before that?
Yeah, I did. So all through, even in year 10, I think at distance education, I think I won the science prize for my year or something. So obviously there was a passion there, and I always, got good marks in lower secondary there. And so I actually, because I didn't have an ATAR, I was directed by the Deakin enrollment team to Deakin College, where I was able to enroll in a Diploma of Science, which is equivalent to the first year of a Bachelor of Science. But slightly different. So, for example, the lectures weren't recorded. We had compulsory lectures, which in some ways I actually think developed more of a team culture in our unit. And basically I completed that part-time over a year and a half. And, of course, because of the Deakin trimester system, it wasn't exactly double the amount of time doing part-time. It was kind of 1/3 kind of, which was great. And then I went into second year Bachelor of Science in the second half of 2017. No, sorry. I'm losing track. The second half of 2018. So I started the diploma in 2017 and I finished up end of Tri 1 2018, and I went straight into some hard chemistry subjects. I remember, I think my first subject at Deakin University was a chemistry and analytical chemistry second year subject and an organic chemistry second year subject. And that, I would have to say that organic chemistry subject is the hardest one I've ever done. It just had so much content. I remember one lecture, the advice was that every slide that had a red border was important. And out of 70 slides, 65 had red borders. So that kind of gives you an idea of kind of the volume of content in that subject of just sort of, wow, this is some heavy stuff.
How was your transition from the college to the full-on kind of university course?
I think it was really good. I think the college really supported, it's the same as first year effectively, but with a little bit more support, I would say, a little bit more one-on-one time with lecturers, and obviously those face-to-face lectures that weren't recorded, I think really made a difference with building a team that you were part of. I did struggle all the way through. So I did my bachelor's part-time and I struggled, and my diploma part-time. I did struggle with building that sort of sense of connection with fellow students and peers, because you'd be with them for a subject and then they'd sort of have a different schedule because they'd be full-time and you wouldn't see them again unless you sort of ran into them in the corridor. So that was kind of something that in the first 2 terms of my diploma of science, I was in the same units with the same people, and I really that I think was the first time I'd really found community again since my ballet days, and it was really nice to find people.
Because you wouldn't have really had it so much in your studies with school for a lot of it, because you were distant.
Yeah, with distance, it was a little bit lonely. Yeah, I will say, had its benefits definitely, but at times, you had to be very self-motivated.
Yeah.
And I think that did set me up for university study quite well, because, you're responsible for your own study. And if you're behind, then it's on you kind of. Yeah, definitely.
You're responsible for your own learning, as they say.
Yes.
Well, you obviously did well in the course eventually and found the hang of it and found your groove, because you're now sort of completing a PhD. Can you explain how that came about and why you chose what you've chosen to do your PhD on?
So I guess all the way through, I will say, so even in my diploma, I graduated with the top marks in my subject for that graduating for the diploma for that graduating cohort.
Nice.
And then I had various academic awards. So I had a scholarship for, I forget the name, I think Deakin Scholarship for Excellence or something.
Sure.
I forget the name. It's on my CV somewhere.
Yep. We'll pop up the CV here. And
make reference. Yes.
Yeah.
And even graduating from my bachelor's, I got the John Clark Prize, which is a prize for the highest chemistry grades from bachelor's going into a chemistry honours, I think. It's a little bit of a niche, I will admit, a niche award, I will say.
Well, you
and
got
obviously acknowledging John Clark, who clearly has some connection with chemistry. I'm not quite sure of the history there. But, undoubtedly probably a great person. But basically, so I finished my bachelor's degree in, I'm trying to think of years, 2022.
Mm-hmm.
I had tried to do 2 majors initially. So I tried to do a plant biology or botany major, and I did a chemistry major as well. I ended up kind of finishing with a minor, which Australian universities don't really do, but, I finished 3 subjects short of the major in plant biology.
Mm-hmm.
It just didn't quite work with scheduling with part-time, and also one of the subjects I actually did during COVID, which had a big road trip where you had to go and collect samples, which for me would have been quite inaccessible, going to the other side of the bay to collect samples for a whole day and do botany. That, thanks to COVID, actually was accessible for me, which is a little bit ironic. But yeah, basically I had hoped to sort of somehow end up somewhere in between, and sort of looking at sort of pharmaceutical products in plant extracts, and with the idea of kind of, looking at plant conservation, and sort of the best way to conserve plants is by conserving the ecosystems, which is quite common. But I kind of realized that the chemistry aspect of that was analytical chemistry, which I won't insult analytical chemists here, but I was very good at analytical chemistry. I very much enjoyed learning about it. I didn't enjoy doing it. So I kind of, and this is part of the advantage of a Bachelor of Science, and even the diploma in that first year, I got to do everything from chemistry, biology to ecology to an elective math subject, really, really great broad sort of span of subjects to really see what I wanted to do and what I enjoyed. So I graduated my Bachelor of Science part-time with a chemistry major. I then went into a honours. Bachelor of Science honours is the full name in chemistry. I don't think honours is really well understood, but basically it's 75% in the case of science, it's 75% research and 25% coursework for a year basically. So each term you basically do 3 units of research and 1 unit of a subject.
Right.
So because I was doing chemistry specialisation, one of the subjects was a science comm unit in the first semester, and then in the second half it was a chemistry, sort of advanced chemistry topics subject, which was pretty heavy, I will say. That was pretty hard. And luckily the last exam I did was in that subject, and I'm looking forward to not doing an exam for quite a while. Thanks. But that really, and I did say, many people, I think employers and students don't really understand the benefit of an honours. And basically it's an extra year of undergrad. You pay effectively an extra year of an undergrad. But in my particular personal case, I basically learnt the same amount of material that I'd learnt in all of the bachelors in a year.
Wow.
But obviously additional material it was a really great growing experience for me in terms of really solidifying how you do research, how you implement the scientific method, how you control variables, and understanding that there are always variables that you can't control. That's just a reality of research, and planning so you don't so those variables don't impact your data it was something I really learned from that year.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a great experience, and I actually got a scholarship as well for that year as well, which covered 3/4 of my fees. So
amazing.
Yeah, basically it was almost a free, and I think I got a couple of prizes. I think I got a prize from Golden Keys. I think I brought in about $8,000 in prizes that year. It was pretty good. So basically I paid for my course fees with prizes basically.
And then you're lousy with prizes.
Yeah, I know. I haven't brought in many recently. I know, it's just
what's going on?
I need to work harder.
Yeah. Well, we'll get to that later on.
Yeah.
So tell me how you got to the PhD, and it focuses on sustainable energy storage materials.
Yeah.
Yeah. How did you get to that being the sort of topic area?
Yeah. So my honours project kind of started in this area, but I really couldn't say even. I think 6 months into my honours project, there was quite a funny example where for the first 6 months, I had thought that 2 acronyms that were TFSI and TFSA, I thought they were 2 different things. Turns out that one stands for, one I is imide and one A is amide. They're exactly the same thing. It's just different terminology. So, for 6 months, I'd been thinking these were 2 different things.
Mm-hmm.
And then I kind of went to write a paper about it, and I realized they were the same thing, which is pretty funny. So
you got all the way to that
point. It kind of shows that learning journey of research that sometimes you can go off, and I will say a little bit half-cocked of sort of, I know, I've read, 20 papers on this. I kind of have a clue. And 6 months down the track, you can go, you know what? I realized I was quite wrong. And, that's part of the journey of research as well, is understanding that it's a learning journey of understanding, and nothing is kind of set in stone as well.
Uh-huh.
So that year the project was on these electrolytes, which are called solvate ionic liquids. And they're a class of ionic liquids which are effectively a molten soup of ions at room temperature. So they're non-flammable, which is really, really desirable in terms of electrolytes, because traditional electrolytes are basically a lithium salt in a solvent, and the solvent is flammable. So this kind of changes the dynamics of that system to being far more viscous, which is a disadvantage because you have lower conductivity, but the advantage is that you have no flammability. There's pros and cons of this, but they're great systems. You can they're used in a whole range of applications, everything from electroplating, so sort of materials or metals extraction, so electrodeposition, all the way through to, I think the funniest application I found was, I think it was as a detector for invisible ink. That was so. I got a literature review published earlier this year in March, and that was the funniest application. Was it that you could use these electrolytes as invisible ink? And I thought, I just thought, okay, so wading through all of this sort of 200 or so papers in the field, and I find one that says invisible ink, and I just thought, I need to put that in my review because that is hilarious,
and important.
Yes, I know, definitely. How else am I going to write my hidden notes? So that's kind of how it started, and then my honors project was on kind of optimizing. So these systems are sort of 3-part systems, and my honors project was optimizing one part of the system, which was only changing 2 things basically. And then my PhD went on to do much more with those systems. So I looked at the lithium salt ratio, so increasing viscosity, what happens there. It's a little bit predictable that if you increase the viscosity, eventually you get to a solid. Anyway. You all know. Some things are a little bit obvious when you've already done them, and you've written a paper on it and you're like, okay, this is obvious. I probably should have seen this a bit earlier. And then I went into the second part of the system is the anion, which you can do a whole heap with, because there's heaps of different anions under the sun. There are some limitations there. So I think a big learning curve for me in my PhD was understanding that just because something is a gap in literature doesn't mean it's a gap in research that you can exploit. So some of these things didn't work and clearly had been tested, but no one had put a paper on them. No one had published on it because it didn't work. So I do hope that by the end of my PhD, I will actually put a paper out that sort of says what didn't work. Yeah. How do we advance the field from here? Because I think that's a really responsible way of saving a lot of resources, because these aren't cheap. Lithium salts are pretty pricey. Some of them, I think the last 25 grams I bought was like $250 or something. So, more environmental. If everyone's trying this and it all doesn't work, then you kind of save time, energy, the environment if you just publish and say, this isn't going to work. Yeah,
don't bother.
Yeah. But my whole plan for the first year of my PhD didn't work. So I was lucky that there were 3 side projects basically that did work.
Is that common as well for people doing a PhD, that there's probably a whole chunk of it where you're going to be doing things that just are going to lead you back around at the beginning?
I think you're quite right there. And in some ways in a PhD, you have to balance, it's original research, but the more groundbreaking that is, the higher the risk that it doesn't work. But at the same time, the higher the payoff, because if you get a paper that basically starts a whole new field, then you're going to be the person who's cited for the next 50 years. But then if you work on something, I've probably gone the other tack where I've worked on something that is quite well established, but I've kind of gone, I feel like there's a gap here, I'll do that. I feel like there's a gap here, I'll do that. But it's not a terribly big field in my particular area of electrolytes.
Where has your research led you, and what's the kind of potential impact of what you've been researching?
So I think throughout my whole research, I've really been understanding the concept of trade-offs. So the whole pitch of my research is that you have what's called structural energy storage. And structural energy storage basically is where, if you imagine a car that has carbon fiber components, you can, say you have a door that's carbon fiber, and it's desirable to be made of carbon fiber because it's much lighter. You can have that door not just as a structural door, but you could actually incorporate a structural energy storage system in there, which is part of the actual structure. So it's not as a separate battery in the door. It's actually the battery is the door. Is kind of the pitch. Of course, there's practical limitations of this. You get into an accident, the door smashes. What happens to the electrolyte? I will admit there's limitations to this. It's
not foolproof just yet.
Yeah. But basically in my area, when we incorporate these electrolytes in polymer systems, we make what's called a bicontinuous electrolyte, which is a 2-phase electrolyte. So it's effectively a liquid electrolyte, which is my systems that I work on, trapped within a resin matrix, trapped within a solid. So you could almost imagine it a little bit like a cottage cheese kind of with a bunch of holes, but there's kind of liquid in the holes.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Yeah. So, and of course, obviously, one of the first side projects in my PhD was this idea that, okay, so we've got this liquid trapped within a solid system. Theoretically, we can recover the liquid solely through breaking up that solid matrix, basically, and I used a blender basically to cut up the matrix, and I recovered over 5 cycles 88% of the electrolyte that had been put in. So that previously was kind of only a theoretical concept of kind of, okay, this is a bicontinuous system. Maybe it's recyclable, but no one had proven it. Whereas I kind of took it to that next level of going, you know what? Why not try this? And basically over 5 weeks, I got a paper out of this project, and I showed the electrolyte wasn't degraded. And a key part of that was that the electrolyte wasn't flammable. So I was able to dry it and remove water from it, and it was, stable. I was blending it, and it was obviously heating up a bit through blending. There wasn't any explosion risk, there's other electrolyte systems that you couldn't do that with. So there's, but that was really cool. And it kind of really showed that sometimes a random idea can turn into, basically that will turn into a chapter in my thesis.
Yeah.
Because, and it really was just an idea of sort of, well, we've got a liquid trapped inside a solid. Can we get the liquid back? Can we recover that? And I reincorporated the liquid in the solid 5 cycles, recovered it over 5 cycles. I definitely pushed the blender to its limits. I gave it many ice baths, and we definitely probably shouldn't be using that blender for any.
Yeah, is the blender okay?
Any margaritas in the office? Definitely, it's in the lab for a reason. So I wouldn't recommend dropping by for a margarita from the lab. But anyway, yeah,
that's really, really interesting. And amazing how your curiosity and seeing gaps has led you to those discoveries. So let's change gears a little bit. So you mentioned before that you acquired a disability when you were about 19, I think. And you've spoken about how this was sort of like a crossroads or a reset for sort of the direction of your life and your studies and what you were going to do. What was it like to start working through this change, and how did you sort of know that this was the right path for you? It's so drastically different from what you were doing before and where you wanted to be.
I'm not sure if anyone ever finds out if anything's the right path. I think you just sort of start enjoying it and develop a passion for doing things well and the small things. But I think for me, so obviously I had been in the dance world since I was 3, but obviously, that was, I think I remember on my YouTube channel when I was 19, I sort of said, I've danced for 87% of my life or something, some stat like that. And I was, that was my whole identity. That was who I was, People would introduce me as, Tim, Tim the dancer, So that community really only exists in dance. So if you're not dancing, you don't see your friends, you don't see, you don't listen to the music, you don't do dance routine, So I did have quite, I think a grieving process of kind of coming to terms with, initially I was sort of maybe in denial a bit of sort of thinking, this is just a pause, this isn't something that's permanent. And then, it kind of hit me over probably about 5 years or so to coming to terms with sort of, okay, I think this is sort of a passion that clearly isn't going to continue.
Wow.
Or maybe, and I think it's probably only maybe in the last 3 years that I've kind of reinvigorated that passion a bit more of sort of, maybe it can continue with the odd TikTok dance.
Yeah.
And
which you've done to great acclaim.
Yes,
on the Deakin channels.
So,
but like that's a massive kind of penny to sort of drop over a long period of time, especially when it's not something that you've had a lot of choice over actively stopping doing? There's a bit of a barrier in the way there.
Yes, it wasn't an easy journey, certainly. There are ups and downs, and I think took a fair bit of resilience to come out on the other side of it with a positive approach rather than a sort of, even just this year, I think it was the third week of September, I had the 10-year anniversary of my last dance show.
Wow.
At a professional level. And I was really tempted. I'm like, I'll do a Facebook post about it. And I ended up just mentioning it to my mum, and that was it. That was all, just a little conversation. And sometimes, I think I was conscious of sort of, yes, I still feel a bit of grief about this, and loss, because it was a passion that I'd had for so long, a dream, something I enjoyed, something I loved, and, such a part of me. And, that doesn't go away overnight. But I think one of the things that I did probably within 6 months of that gap year, basically, of sort of getting more ill, was I really sought out volunteering activities, because I'd volunteered in my teens quite a bit before going sort of professional with the dance. Initially, like when I was 15, I volunteered with Gateways, which is a great local organisation in Geelong. I volunteered with Emotions 21, which is a dance group for Down syndrome kids. And I think that was, at the time was completing the Duke of Edinburgh Silver Award, which requires community service. And I think that was a really great prompt.
Wow,
to sort of
so
get
you
me
were already kind of, in this field a little bit, even when you were dancing.
It's kind of funny, sort of reflecting, kind of thinking, okay, so how have my views on disability changed from when I was 15 volunteering with kids, where I was sort of there so that they were interacting with another young person who would make a joke. Like I remembered one of the kids, Josh, who'd, make a joke and, pull a booger out of his nose. And, it's just hilarious. And, just stuff that teenagers do. And, I do reflect on that now and sort of think, okay, so how's my view of that changed? And I think the overall perspective of it, of kind of viewing the person first over any disability, they're a person. And of course they have feelings, they have motivations, they have aspirations, they have thoughts. And I think that, that crosses through to the work I do now, well and truly. But I will say that work when I was a teenager really was driven by examples from my mum. So I had seen my mum from even just the age of 13, volunteering in many organisations like Geelong Youth Choir, Landcare. She was on the board of Geelong Landcare Network for a number of years. So I really saw that example of community services being something that is important to give back to your community. And, basically from the age that I could get a job, I didn't, but I went and volunteered basically with my time. Yeah.
And so what are you doing today? And I guess how did you end up at the United Nations, advocating for this stuff on one of the biggest platforms in the world?
It's been quite a journey. So probably over the last 5 years. So I joined the board of Physical Disability Australia, which is a disabled people's organisation. So I describe disabled people's organisations almost as a union for the disability community. So we advocate for our members. You have to be a member to join, or so you have to be a disabled person to have a full vote. And all of our governing bodies of disabled people's organisations are made up of at least 50% people with disabilities. Most are actually 90% plus. But in terms of governance documents, you have to have at least 50% people with disabilities. So that was a real eye-opening experience with joining Physical Disability Australia. And in some ways that was kind of really prompted by COVID, that so much had gone online. I kind of had wound back a little bit more of the more face-to-face voluntary stuff, and I had a little bit more time to sort of go, okay, where do I want to go to next? I'd kind of done a lot of climate activism with Australian Youth Climate Coalition before that, and kind of crossed a little bit into the disability space with that. And I kind of had a little bit of an urge to learn more about the disability space and understand, I guess, a little bit more about the systems that I'd interacted with. Obviously, I'd interacted with Centrelink. I've been on hold, I think, for 2.5 hours once. I made the mistake of trying to take a screenshot of the time I've been on hold. And of course, when you do a screenshot on a phone, it hangs up. I'd had those experiences. I'd encountered barriers. I've been into Centrelink before and had that experience of almost passing out at Centrelink and feeling pretty damn terrible. Yeah. And I kind of wanted to not just share those experiences, but learn from others in the disability community about their diversity of experiences. And I think that was 2021 was such a great learning curve for me. I think every month of that year, I learned about a new thing that the NDIS funded. That's the National Disability Insurance Scheme, which is sort of a support scheme for people with disabilities in Australia. I think so much of that you kind of read a government website and you go, okay, so what does this mean?
What does that mean?
But until you actually talk to the people who are accessing these systems, using them, navigating the community every day based on being reliant on these systems, until you really listen to those people, you don't really understand these things and these systems in society. So that was when I really condensed some thoughts around the difference between individual advocacy and systemic advocacy, and conversely, the difference between individual issues and barriers that someone encounters and when that becomes systemic. So, for example, if I have an issue navigating the Public Transport Victoria app, Journey Planner, that's an issue I'm encountering. But if that's actually an issue with the accessibility of the app, that's not an issue that's not my issue. That's a systemic issue for every person with disability and every person who's not disabled as well, who's accessing that app, who may be utilising some of those accessibility features of larger font, for example, or different contrast. So that's kind of, I think, a good learning curve journey. And that's a bit of a journey in disability advocacy where you understand that everything you've experienced, yes, it's valuable, yes, it's relevant, but it's not relevant to be discussed at every point in time. Yes, right. You're there because you've got lived experience, but the issues you're talking about is systemic, and the focus of those is not you, kind of. And that's kind of, sometimes you have to kind of take a step back and sort of think, okay, this is a systemic issue, and yes, I can talk about 45 minutes about personal experiences on this, but what the conversation here is about how we deconstruct this systemic issue or address it in a positive way for our community.
And so how did you end up speaking at the UN? What was the process to, do they email you? Hi, it's the UN here. We your advocacy has been noted. Come and do a speech. How did that happen?
Pretty much. It was a surprisingly casual process.
Really,
I will say. So I think the biggest hurdle is actually being able to register for one of these conferences. So the organisation you're registering with has to have a special status with the UN. So it has to have consultative status with the, I think it's Economic and Social Affairs of the UN. department. So it's called Eco-SOC status. That means you can register people as non-governmental observers, basically, or participants. I first heard about this conference, so the United Nations Conference of State Parties for the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which happens every year in June in New York. I first heard about it about 3 years ago, and I sort of thought, oh, okay, this would be great. I'd love to go. And there were opportunities that sort of opened up, and it wasn't until last year that I had a few domestic meetings with Physical Disability Australia. Our board team met for the first time since pre-COVID, and that was just great, just to see the whole. We have 2 directors in every state and territory of Australia, so it was a massive team, sort of 16 or so just in our governance team, and that was just fantastic, just to meet face to face. And I really, I think I'd really missed that, and I really realised the value of that. And after that, I sort of thought, okay, I've got meds kind of a little bit more stabilised. I've got, plenty of Valium for the flight. I kind of worked out a little bit more of a routine with flying, and things kind of aligned with joining the Australian Federation of Disability Organisations. So I was initially there on their board as a delegate from Physical Disability Australia last year when I was filling in as president for Physical Disability Australia, PDA. And then I actually was co-opted to the board in December and basically for international engagement. So this year I represented AFDO, the Australian Federation of Disability Organisations, at the Global Disability Summit in April in Berlin, which was great. And in usual Berlin style, the last day of the conference, they had a club night, which was just great. And, people doing wheelies in wheelchairs at the front of the dance floor in an accessible club. I just thought it was just the best ending of a great conference.
Nice.
And then the opportunity basically arose to go to the UN in June. I kind of thought, I can't pass this up, really. This is, and in some ways, it was kind of funny that there's a lot of processes at the UN. So I did find the event not, like there were aspects of the event that weren't as good as what I'd been told they were. But there were other, like the side events were just fantastic. Listening from the head of inclusion at the World Bank, you can't listen to them just anywhere.
Yeah.
And even just the UN security guy at the front, who I used to always go up the ramp to enter, and the guy would always say, "Oh, you need to go back to the queue," and I'd say, "No, I can't stand in the queue because I've got a heart condition. Can you let me in, please?" And, like those barriers that, even at the UN, we're encountering barriers around invisible disability and non-obvious disabilities. And of course, if someone went through in a wheelchair, they'd be fine because they'd be assumed they need the ramp.
Yeah.
But someone who, takes their time walking up the ramp and, says, "Oh, I can't stand in the queue." There's those sort of perceptions around sort of, well, what do you mean? You look healthy. But a lot of the UN proceedings is a little bit pompous. So, it's country statements sort of saying their 2 cents on what a great job they've done, when in reality they probably could have done a lot more, I will say. And I'm not picking out any countries here. I'm just sort of saying that's, it's their pitch to sort of say how great we are to the world.
Yeah.
But how great they are and how much they've achieved is obviously debatable. But basically, I had the opportunity. There was a Google form, I think, a week before that went out, and I emailed my boss at AFDO and I sort of said, "Oh, hey, is anyone else putting in to speak?" Because this year we had quite a small delegation. He said, and I sort of said, "Oh, I reckon I might speak about this topic." And I didn't find out. I was flying out Friday. What day was it? I think I was flying out Friday evening. And I didn't find out I was speaking on Tuesday the following week until Friday morning. And basically I got home and I said to my mum, "I need to write a speech."
As in on Friday morning?
Yeah. So basically.
Like the day that you were to leave?
Well, 3 business days, if you call it that way.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So it was quite short notice, and I was kind of, okay, great. I need to put a speech together pretty fast.
Oh.
It had to be 3 minutes, and I did cut in. I think I got to 2 minutes 40 or something, which was popular because with the person who was facilitating the session. Yeah, but it was quite a pinch me moment, and quite a, I don't know, I think quite a sort of condensing of much work. You know, I think we do a lot of voluntary work in the sector that never gets recognised or never gets talked about. You know, for example, with the Commonwealth Children and Youth Disability Network in 2022, 3, I'm losing track of years, 2023, I wrote their Commonwealth Youth Code of Practice, which was all about how basically we could elevate the voice of youth in decision-making bodies in the Commonwealth Secretariat and all of the various Commonwealth networks. It's been signed on by about 19 or so different Commonwealth bodies, which is fantastic. And it doesn't have my name on it. So, you know, I wrote it.
Interesting.
And anyway. Yeah, so there's sort of those things that, you know, you contribute to, you put a lot of time into, and then it can be kind of nice when you get to that point at the UN where you're sort of like, you know what? Yes, I'm feeling imposter syndrome well and truly right now of thinking, wow, I'm in this room next to speaking next to a dignitary, or, the delegation from Peru before me or something. Or actually, I think it was maybe the delegation from Jordan before me, because I do remember there was some captions at the end of their statement that I had to cut out just for sort of apolitical reasons. But basically, it was just such a pinch me moment. It was over with very fast.
Yeah.
It was very fast. I couldn't work out the microphone because you have to press a button and then the microphone lights up, but you're supposed to press the button when they announce you, not after. So there was a bit of a delay. And in the video, if you ever watch the video, it's a little bit awkward. And then I didn't know where the camera was. So I'm reading my speech and there's no footage of me looking straight at the camera because I didn't know where the damn camera was that was filming.
So they didn't really kind of like guide you to what you need to do.
And the camera takes a while to find you. It's kind of funny. It's like, okay, you know all people who are speaking from non-governmental organisations speak from one desk, the NGO desk. That's it. There's one desk in the whole place. Like, just zoom in there. But it kind of takes about 5 seconds for them to find me. It's quite funny. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, but it was a pretty cool experience. And it was great, straight after the head of inclusion at the International Telecommunications Union comes over and gives me a card and sort of said, oh, we should collaborate. So I think it was really good to raise that profile of me and the organisation.
Yeah.
Because, a lot of mainstream disability organisations in Australia and disabled people's organisations don't have very much youth representation.
Yeah.
And for example, at Physical Disability Australia, when I was elected president there, I was the youngest president at the time or chair of an Australian disabled people's organisation. So it's fairly groundbreaking.
Wow.
It was a little bit of a, I learned a lot in that position. But I think anyone would, and no matter what age they were. Yeah.
Do you think that your lived experience of living with a disability has shaped your thinking and research at all?
I think definitely. So I don't think, and you could talk to anyone in any sector about this, that cross-sector knowledge, experience and skills is never wasted. And I think certainly, I have written my own appeals to the Administrative Appeals Tribunal for NDIS applications. I'm well versed in navigating paperwork and navigating systems. And I think when you encounter those barriers regularly, you really do have a fair bit of resilience that you think out of the box with solutions. And I think, you have and I do find this with my research when I sort of connect it with broader sort of themes of, renewables transition. And I think that broader view of issues and solutions within the world and society is I think invaluable to any work, and particularly research. And the intersection between the two, between the research and the advocacy work, is that both are working towards a better world. And take that in many ways. Better world for people, better world for research, better world for economic outcomes. It crosses many sectors, many demographics. I often talk about, inclusion of people with disability, that, if particularly with mainstreaming education, for example, that if you've got a person with disability who's gone through a mainstream school, they're more likely to go through a mainstream higher education, and they're more likely to go into a high paid job and contribute high tax revenue. So they're actually, in terms of society, in terms of government, they're actually contributing more. Whereas exclusion, on the other hand, if you had them working a menial job in a coffee shop or in a sheltered workshop or Australian Disability Enterprises, as they're currently called, earning, I think it's less than $3 an hour.
Wow.
Obviously they're not contributing
as much.
Yeah. And I think it's also about recognizing that capabilities there and capacity is always able to be grown and enhanced with anyone.
Yeah. Why is it important to have people with disabilities in research and in STEM?
Yeah, so there's a couple of points on this. So just from a stats perspective, obviously globally about 17% of the world's population is people with disability. In Australia, it's around 20%, depending on which census you look at. So obviously if you're excluding 20% of of people in society from your workforce, then there's got to be talent there that you're missing out on.
Yeah.
I don't think anyone would debate that. There's got to be people who are talented, skilled, bring an edge to your work that you're going to be missing out on if you're putting up barriers to that community. From an economic standpoint, if you have people with disability in your team, in your business, in your workplace, in your research, you're more likely to be making products, services and offerings that are relevant to not just the rest of society, but the whole of society, including people with disabilities. So, that's 20% of people who are going to be buying things, who are going to be, they're consumers. They're going to be buying things in our economy. If you're leaving them out, then that's a big tangent of your market that you're just missing out on. So that's it from, I guess, from a economic perspective. There's quite a lot of stats on diversity of teams, particularly in delivering leadership teams, in delivering and decision-making teams, in delivering better outcomes. There's great research on women in boards, for example, and actually, companies that actually have more women on boards from diverse backgrounds performing better than companies that don't. So we actually know that, there's evidence that diversity leads to better and more profitable economic outcomes across sectors.
Yeah.
So I guess, if you're leaving people with disabilities out of research and STEM, then you don't know what possibilities you could be missing out on, would be my takeaway.
Yeah, well put.
Yeah.
And better decisions, better products, better for everyone.
Yeah.
Not just people with disabilities. You co-founded the ChemAbility Network. Tell me a little bit about it. What is it and why did you found it?
Yeah, so the ChemAbility Network was launched in 2024 within the Royal Australian Chemical Institute, which is the professional body for chemists in Australia. I do mean chemists as in people who do chemistry, not people who run a pharmacy. I will just sort of make that clear.
Yeah.
So basically before that, we had done a survey 2 years previously that had shown I think around 77% of voluntary respondents to that survey were people with disability, but we didn't really know who they were, what they were doing, what levels they were at in their careers in the institute. And we really wanted to create a community where we could share our journeys, share, our experiences, who we are, and really build community and support our peers. So within 3 days of launching, I'd found out that the I think the president is the correct term, of the New South Wales branch of the Chemical Institute was a person with disabilities, and she has deafness in one ear.
Right.
So, before that, if someone had said, are there people with disabilities in leadership positions in the Chemical Institute? I would have said probably not. But now I sort of say, well, you know what? I know someone, Marie Stewart, who is breaking ground and has a great career, is just a great scientist. So it really allowed us to find each other in the institute. It's because it's about 3,000 or so members.
Wow.
Across Australia. So before that, we didn't know where we were. We didn't know who was there. And I think quite often there's this discussion around diversity of sort of, well, we don't have to do anything for people with disabilities because we haven't got any. And, one of the first steps for disability is getting disaggregated data and understanding sort of, okay, well, there are people with disability here. Let's see what barriers they're encountering. And then I think the third step is really establishing a community where we can find each other, because that is really important. Yeah. So it was co-founded by the education manager at the Chemical Institute, Hannah McCarthy. And yeah, basically we had a great conversation about sort of, so if you are disabled, how do you know who else is disabled? And we just sort of thought, well, why don't we set up this online forum to find people, to find our community, and we can find each other. Yeah.
Why is community so important to you?
Well, I think I'm going to sound a little bit unionist in this. Without community, you can't organise. So without community, you can't share experiences. You can't understand that your individual issues are not your own, that they're systemic. You can't advocate for those systemic issues, and you can't achieve change. So I guess, that's my takeaway from that. If I have an issue and I write to my local member of parliament about it, it is not as influential as if 10 people wrote or an organisation that represented 10 people wrote. Or an organisation that represented, for example, Physical Disability Australia represents 1,200 members with disabilities across Australia. And every time they would write a letter, it would represent the views of our members and elevate those perspectives of lived experience with a lens to understand the systemic issues.
Yeah. You seem to have quite a systems sort of mindset, even in the research that you spoke about before, of just like trying things, and even if they failed, recording that somewhere so that, it's not necessarily something that someone needs to go out and waste resources doing again. Have you always had that, and where does that come from?
I don't know. I think I kind of have understood that a bit more maybe over the past 5 years, because it is something that when you first join an organisation and learn a lot more, your brain is just on absorption mode for so long, and it takes a little bit for it to kind of switch to interpretation and reflection and sort of thinking, okay, so what does that mean? What do those trends mean? What does this mean in the bigger picture? Yeah.
How can visibility and representation help shift perceptions and open pathways?
So you can't be what you don't see. So, there's plenty of research on this in women in STEM. If you haven't got a role model, for example, a female professor, for example, in your workplace, then you're much likely to reach a point, for young women are much likely to reach a point where they're promoted to that level. It's the same in disability and other marginalised communities. That representation is so important because without that kind of showing someone who has basically broken through the glass ceiling, you don't see that as a possible career pathway for you.
Yeah.
And even for me, like when I talk to people and I sort of say, oh yeah, so my day job is doing a PhD in materials chemistry. And I say, traditionally that's quite an inaccessible area. And there are quite inaccessible aspects of my job. There are other aspects that are quite accessible. I run my own research schedule. I can choose when I'm in the lab. If I'm feeling sick, I don't have to be in the lab. Basically I run my day-to-day schedule, which is very accessible. So I think in some ways, if we don't have those people talking about what it's like to be in those positions, then the kids of today won't see that as a future they can be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You talked a bit about it then, but what are some of the barriers that you've faced in some of the work that you've had to do, and how have you been able to work around them?
Yeah. So one thing I will acknowledge is that it's quite an emerging space of understanding disability and accessibility in STEM. So there still is no best practice guide to how to set up a laboratory in an accessible way, for example.
Really?
And I actually was in a consultation with some people at University of Western Sydney who are setting up their biomedical accelerator facility, and they want it to be accessible. And I was in that meeting earlier this year, and I said to them, this is really groundbreaking work you're doing, because no one else has documented this before. Yes, we know how to run a conference in an accessible way, but what about a workplace in science? What about a lab, And I did encourage them to create a resource when they finish their project to hopefully share with others so that they can I guess take that away and make their facilities more accessible. One thing that is quite a barrier is the deficit model. So viewing disability in the workplace as a risk. And for example, the last time I passed out was 5 years ago from my heart condition. If I talked to my lab techs about that, they would be quite concerned and probably wouldn't want me in the lab. At the same time, I probably handle chloroform on at least a once monthly basis. And I'm not sniffing chloroform, I can assure you. But, there's a risk of me passing out from chloroform.
Yeah.
So I think sometimes,
as there would be for anyone.
Yeah, sometimes I think we have to be a little bit realistic about the risks in these environments, and that if I'm the last time I had a bad neurological exacerbation in early September this year, I knew 4 hours beforehand that things were going downhill.
Yeah,
and it lasted for 5 days, dizziness, vomiting, nasty symptoms. But, by the time it got bad, I was already at home. I was in my bed. There was no risk to anyone or myself.
Yeah.
So I think too often we sort of view these things as kind of a massive risk, rather than sort of thinking, well, if someone's nervous, for example, last year I developed a minor tremor condition. The only time I found it impacting my work was one time when I was pipetting something and I kind of was shaking a bit. Everyone shakes a bit. You focus on something, you try and pipette it in. That fine motor control is something that's variable for everyone.
Yeah.
So, do you make a big deal about it and sort of say you can't be in a lab because you're a risk? Or do you sort of think, well, you know what, this person is part of our team, part of society, we accept the diversity. I'm sure if we looked at Deakin's value pages on our website on equity, diversity, inclusion, I'm sure there'd be wording around we accept the diversity of people. This is our work. This is a workplace. A workplace is a subset of society. Of course, the diversity of society should be represented and is represented in a workplace.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think one thing the deficit model kind of is a negative of that is that there can be a lot of stigma around people disclosing their disabilities in the workplace and getting reasonable adjustments, which is certainly something that I think all organisations need to work on better around breaking down those misconceptions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that people don't have a fear of raising what they need adjusted for them.
And the last point on that, I was actually talking to an architect at a meeting on Friday of the Victorian Disability Advisory Council, Nicole, and she said that she had experience from designing a laboratory where it was said that if someone couldn't complete tasks that were required in the laboratory because they were disabled, then they didn't need to make the laboratory accessible. So I'll just sort of summarize it. If a space is inaccessible, of course we won't be there. If you hold a meeting upstairs in a non-wheelchair accessible venue, you can't say, well, no one with a wheelchair has come to the meeting, so it doesn't matter. You don't know who you've excluded through accessibility, through inaccessibility, sorry. Yeah. So I think that's a really important point to focus on.
Yeah, definitely. What can allies without disabilities do to support inclusion and progress in this space? Have you got any views on that?
So a really important thing that allies can support is mainstreaming. And mainstreaming is basically removing people with disabilities from being segregated in separate spaces. And we've seen a lot of discussion nationally around this, around recommendations from the Disability Royal Commission that recommended that we move away from segregated schools to basically integration of students with disabilities in mainstream schools. And that's where that mainstreaming term occurs.
Right.
There's lots of, I won't go into the school debate, but I will talk about the pathway between the two. If someone's in a segregated school, they are much more likely to be in a segregated group home. They're much more likely to be in a segregated workplace. Their pathway in life is vastly different.
Yeah.
If someone is in a mainstream school, they are much more likely to go to a mainstream educational institution in high school. They are much more likely to go to a mainstream higher education institution. And they're much more likely to go into a workplace that is non-segregated. So those pathways are very different. One is where people with disabilities are part of society, and one is where people with disabilities remain shut behind a closed door, separated from everyone else. I think you know which one I would prefer. And I think most people would agree that one where people with disabilities are part of society is better for everyone, for the whole community.
Yeah.
Supporting that is really important in allyship. That is something that is an ongoing change. I agree it can't be done overnight, but it's something that needs to be done and it's something that we need to work towards.
Yeah.
In my lifetime, I shouldn't be talking about this at the age of 80.
Yeah.
It should be done in the next 10, 15 years, well and truly. Yeah. The second part is, I think, better training around empathy and, not making assumptions. Assumptions is kind of the first rule of disability inclusion is don't make assumptions. And the second rule is a polite question is perfectly fine.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll use the example of my friend Helen, who she was representing Blind Citizens Australia at the recent conference I went to in Fiji, and we flew back into Melbourne together. So we were navigating the terminal, and at one point it was kind of unclear whether the airline staff were sort of taking a long time or whether we were we were going to have to wait there for 15 minutes. And I said to Helen, do you want just to sort of take my elbow and we'll go to the baggage check and do that? And Helen said, Actually, Tim, I'd prefer it if the airline staff just did their job. It's okay to wait here for a little bit and just let them do their job.
Mm-hmm.
And that, I asked a polite question. I don't know about the accessibility of Helen, who's blind. And she responded back politely saying what she wanted. That's perfectly fine. And, I'll use my example. At one event in O Week once, I was referred to as Sunnies multiple times at an event.
Uh-huh.
So, and just putting that in perspective, I wear sunnies because of my impairments. So, it would be kind of akin to calling someone who uses crutches, or not the best practice. I will say, don't do that. But basically, that was based off an assumption that I was just wearing sunglasses to be cool,
it's your thing,
or be weird. I don't know.
Style.
But there could have been a polite question just at the start of sort of saying, "Oh, why are you wearing sunglasses, Tim?" And I would have said, "Oh, I have light sensitivity due to a neurological condition. I'm not a rock star. I am at chemistry, but I'm not doing chemistry today. So I assure you, it's just because of light sensitivity."
Yeah.
I'm normally make a joke out of that. But yeah, basically that's a good example of kind of that assumptions and just asking a polite question to break down assumptions.
Yeah.
I think that's, I've probably touched on that enough around misconceptions and stigma. One of the things I might say also is that there's significant barriers around part-time and full-time issues with students. So during my studies, there were academic awards that I wasn't eligible for as a part-time student.
Oh, okay.
So, for example, even in my diploma, I would have been eligible for an award if I was full-time after the first semester that would have paid for the rest of my fees, but I wasn't eligible because I was part-time. Even with the scholarships I applied for, I always had to sort of explain an exemption. And, I think that's perfectly fine, but I think it's perfectly fine to ask people to explain politely why they, so why are you part-time? That's perfectly fine. The issue is where there's just blanket sort of, no, it's only for full-time. There's similar issues with PhD scholarships, for example. There's lack of flexibility, and there's also taxation issues. So I actually wanted to go 0.8 FTE in my PhD. The only option was to go 0.5 or full-time, or 1.0 full-time equivalent. 0.5 and 1, that's not exactly flexible. And then there's also issues with taxability. If I was not full-time with a PhD, my stipend would be taxable.
Right.
And it's not very much already, I might say.
Yeah.
I will acknowledge that the stipend at present is below minimum wage when you actually crunch the hourly rate.
Mm-hmm.
It would be good if we moved to a state in Australia where the researchers who are building the R&D for our nation's future are paid at least minimum wage. I will say that.
Okay.
Yeah. I know that sounds a little bit political, but
Well, let's talk a bit about the future.
Yeah.
So, Tim, you're nominated for the 2026 Young Australian of the Year Award. Firstly, congratulations. Secondly, how does that feel?
I'm still kind of coming to terms with it all. So I'm one of 4 very impressive nominees. I will acknowledge my fellow nominees in the Victorian category for the Victorian Young Australian of the Year Award 2026.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things I might say is that there's been so much community excitement and shared joy from this announcement. So many organisations that I volunteer with have sort of been really excited about sort of the recognition of this, not just to my contributions, but to the broader contributions of their organisations and not-for-profits, which is very exciting. Yeah, it's been quite a joy to see so many people so elated by it.
Yeah.
I think one other thing is that it is quite groundbreaking. for the disability community. So from what I understand, I will say this from a quick Google, so I will qualify my statement.
It's wrong.
From what I understand, yes, yeah. So take this with a grain of salt. From what I understand, I am the third nominee in the category of Young Victorian of the Year. Young Australian of the Year, Victoria, 2026. I'm the third nominee in that category who has publicly disclosed that they have disabilities. And no one so far has ever won that category who's been a disabled person. So, it's great recognition for our community.
Yeah.
It is these are the 2026 awards. People with disability have always been in our community. And I think it's great to see representation there. And I'm looking forward to more representation in the awards from our community in the future. Yep. I think also my nomination is quite good around perceptions and sort of, that I am a person with disability. At present, I'm halfway off a disability support pension. I still receive a means-tested social security benefit from the Australian government. I'm earning a living with a PhD stipend. I also earn some money from serving on a Victorian public sector board, the Victorian Disability Advisory Council. I'm not a burden to society. I've well and truly worked my bum off to contribute to society, to contribute to my field. And I think it's really important that we have people who from the disability community who can sort of show to the broader community that we are capable, that we are more than some of the assumptions around our capability, that we really can do anything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very well said. Final big question, what kind of impact do you want your work to have over the sectors that you work in, and what do you want to see change in Australia when it comes to disability rights and inclusion?
So the main word I normally use around the impact I want to see is multiplicative. So if you imagine a person with disability who is employed in an entry-level position in a company or even, public sector, a government role, their impact is only within their team. Yes, they're breaking down barriers. Yes, by their very existence, they're encountering barriers and, being resilient. Good, great job to them. But if they're in a leadership position, leading organizations, leading programs, they're making a multiplicative effect across society. Their effect is amplified, and that's really what my aim has always been. And in many ways, I work across sectors. I work across governance, research, and disability policy. And in all those areas, I bring together different aspects of the different sectors that I work in. And I really try to use that to amplify the effect. I think one of the big impacts I would like to really achieve with my work is that really communicating in advocacy that the label of disability or person with disability does not equate to capability. And that's really related to breaking down assumptions, which I touched on previously, but I will regale you with a funny story around assumptions. So when I was landing in New York from, going there in June for the Conference of State Parties for the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities.
At the UN?
Yep, at the UN, yep. Yes, yeah. When I was transiting from one of the airports, which was an interesting experience, I wanted the authentic kind of.
This is the transfer,
transfer,
the
trains
flight.
and everything.
Oh my goodness, yeah.
Well, sorry, the trains from the airport.
Okay, yeah.
And I had to get 4 trains into my hotel, which was interesting. Not the most accessible, I will say, but anyway. So the second train I got on, I had bought a disabled ticket because I thought, well, I'm going to a conference for people with disabilities. I'm disabled, been disabled for a while. I think I can probably, buy a disabled ticket. I mean, I am here for a UN conference on disability after all.
Mm-hmm.
So I had a ticket inspector who was rather entertaining, who kept insisting that I had bought a child's ticket. And this conversation went around in circles for about 6 times of sort of, you've bought a child's ticket. No, it's a disabled ticket. You've bought a child's ticket, round in circles, kind of. And I didn't really notice this, but there was a guy in the background sort of leaning against one of the doors who turns to the conductor and says in this great Harlem accent, "Can't you see he's blind?" So, we've got the assumption from this guy that I am blind because I'm wearing dark glasses. We've got the assumption from the ticket inspector that I'm not disabled because I don't look disabled.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got assumptions both ways. Somewhere in the middle is probably the right answer. But it was just a really, really great example. And it was just hilarious of just kind of this. And then eventually the ticket inspector said, "Oh, okay, I'll take your ticket."
He's blind.
But
so
he's blind. Yeah. But it's a good example of assumptions because, the ticket inspector could have asked, "Oh, so why did you purchase a disabled ticket?" "Oh, because I'm disabled." It's not a complicated question or answer, is it?
Yeah.
And vice versa. The guy who assumed I was blind, yes, that was hilarious. But it was an assumption nonetheless that wasn't correct. So if he'd, tried to grab my bag, assuming I was blind, a polite question probably would have been maybe the solution probably.
Yeah.
Yeah. In terms of what I would like to see in Australia when it comes to disability rights and what would I like to see change, I think a Federal Human Rights Act is really important. This has been flagged in recommendations from the Disability Royal Commission. A really important part of this will be balancing mainstreaming of, people with disability need to be in this act. But we also need to address key issues specific to the disability community in this act. So there is a push to have a separate act. There's debates about that. But, I think it's in line with mainstreaming and I think broader society that, broader Australian values that a Human Rights Act should be for everyone. And it should address issues, potential discrimination that a whole society may experience and, ensure that doesn't occur. So that's a really high priority. At a state and territory level, I think it's really important that human rights commissions have, and I did write on my notes here, have some teeth. And what I mean by that, at present, there's no ability for human rights commission. So, for example, in Victoria, the Victorian Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission is what it's called. And it's governed by an act from 2010. It has no ability to compel parties to the table. So if I have a discrimination case against, for example, a local supermarket, they can just ignore the communication from the Human Rights Commission.
Yeah.
And it goes nowhere.
Right.
Which really does that. I mean, it doesn't really resolve the issue, does it? If you're just not responding to your emails.
Yeah.
It's sort of sweeping things under the rug. And at the same time as well, there's issues around not being able to actually introduce binding agreements. So, for example, if an agreement is made under conciliation between the two parties, it has to be appealed through a separate channel through the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, from what I gather, to actually be enforced if a party just disagrees to it.
Right.
After agreement. So, so basically there needs to be some teeth, there needs to be more funding because at present the wait list, by the time you actually have lodged something, it takes about 15 minutes to lodge a discrimination complaint with the commission, which isn't bad, but it takes about 9 months to get a response.
Wow.
Which, and look, that is from a few years ago, so I'm not saying that's a current figure, but that I think,
it's a little long.
Yes. And the reality is that this is discrimination around someone accessing society. That discrimination continues after, if if I've encountered that barrier in the supermarket, that barrier isn't just going away.
No.
So for that 9 months, it's being left unaddressed, and you're not even starting the process of discussing
even
how to
after
resolve
9 months, you're not even.
You're not even
the start of the
Yes.
process. It's just the response.
Yeah. So better funding, more teeth, or some teeth, and actually some bite. Yeah. Definitely.
Let's finish up with some quick fire wrap up questions. Just some quick answers on these ones if you can. What's something that most people don't know about your research?
So one of the funniest things about my research was that I mentioned the paper around where I recycled that electrolyte. I bought a highly sophisticated piece of scientific equipment for that. I went down to JB Hi-Fi. Sorry, I probably shouldn't drop brand names on this.
That's
but
all right.
I went down to a local
One of our
electronics
sponsors.
retailer and I bought a NutriBullet blender, an entry-level fruit blender. And I did nurse it. I definitely pushed it past its limits. I definitely voided its warranty, I will say. I won't be returning it, obviously. Gave it many ice baths. But
maybe we should try and return it on the show.
It worked for a whole paper where I recycled things for 6 cycles in total, one pilot cycle and then 5 separate cycles of repeating the process. It just shows research doesn't need complicated tech. Sometimes you can just go to your local electronics store and get what you need for the job.
Wow.
Yep.
NutriBullet. Use the code word stories at checkout.
Yeah.
What's one myth about disability that you wish more people understood?
Yeah. So I have mentioned this previously, but polite questions are completely acceptable and don't make assumptions.
Yeah.
So they're the key takeaways.
Yeah. Good ones. And finally, what's a moment in your journey that you're most proud of?
So I did toss up around this, but I really narrowed it down to my co-option to the board of the Australian Federation of Disability Organisations in December 2024. So that was really the first time where on a board I was not elected to that position. I was appointed by the board for my skills as a young person with disability. And basically, the message that sent was that the organisation was stronger with a young person with disability involved than without. And that really, was fundamental support to a whole heap of representations, going to the Global Disability Summit in April, going to the UN and speaking at the UN in June, and recently representing the same organisation, the Australian Federation of Disability Organisations, in Fiji at the Pacific Disability Dialogue in the last couple of weeks.
Yeah. Wow. Well, Tim Harte, honestly, it's been amazing to chat with you today. We're all pulling for you at the Australian of the Year Awards, which will happen probably around the time we release this episode. And thanks so much for sharing your incredible story and so much about your incredible work here on Stories of Wonder.
Thanks. It's been a great chat. Thank you. Thanks for having me.